Welcome to another presentation of the NIH Biosketch, What You Need to Know. So this presentation, like the other ones, is going to go through what you need to know to put together a really strong biosketch, but we're also going to incorporate all of the updates that are required for applications on or after January 25th of 2022. So what is a biosketch? So essentially a biosketch is your opportunity to describe your scientific accomplishments, why you are qualified for the position that you're applying for that grant application, whether if it's as a PI or another role such as co-investigator. And it gives you the opportunity to describe your work, what you've done in the field, and sort of publications or other relevant areas of interest. And so the biosketch is divided up into a couple of different sections. And so we'll go section by section and talk through, what are the NIH requirements, but also what makes a strong biosketch for your application. And then we'll also go through all of these updates. So I've included the notices here that reference these updates. Originally, this was for applications on or after May 25th of 2021, but they were not being enforced until January 25th of 2022. So these are all changes that you should be currently incorporating into your biosketch. So the first thing I think is always important to talk about is who actually needs to provide a biosketch on an NIH application. So NIH requires that all key personnel, other significant contributors, and K Award mentors are required to provide biosketches for their role on the application. So people like research staff or administrative staff are not required to have biosketches. Now, there is a category of people who sometimes need biosketches, but sometimes don't, and it really depends on their role. And we'll get into that in the next slide, but those can include consultants, advisory board members, maybe some other stakeholders such as community partners, patient advocates, things like that. For whatever your role is, whichever one of these you're falling into, the reason that biosketches are so important is that it gives you the opportunity to tell reviewers why you're qualified for that position. So the NIH defines key personnel as obviously the principal investigator, PI, but any other individual who's contributing to what they call the scientific development and or execution of a project in a substantive measurable way, whether or not they request salary compensation. So this typically includes what we would call co-investigators, but again, can include those other roles such as consultants or stakeholders that maybe are contributing to the scientific development or execution of your project. So really, it's up to you as the PI to determine what people's individual roles are and how they are contributing to your project to determine whether or not they would be required to include a biosketch or not. So biosketch itself is made up of a couple of sections. Previous versions had 4 sections, which I've listed here, and I've crossed off the last section D, research support, because that is no longer a component, but we'll get into those updates, and I'm going to go through each of these 3 sections in just a second. So the first section is section A, the personal statement. And this is where you get an opportunity to explain your qualifications for the project. So if you're the PI, what is your expertise in the field? What is your previous leadership experience, et cetera? The NIH gives you a couple of points that you can touch on, including your training, any previous work, technical expertise, scientific environment in which you're working, collaborators, which I think is important if you have previously worked with collaborators who are also on the project that you're applying for, and then any past performance in the related fields. So they also mentioned that anything that is not mentioned in section C can also be included here. And you can also include up to 4 of the most relevant publications and or products to cite in your personal statement as well. There's an additional update that is included in here, and I'll get to those slides in just a minute. For the personal statement, though, this is the meat of the biosketch. It's one of the most important parts and comes right at the top. And this is sort of a narrative, often a paragraph or 2, emphasizing your expertise and hitting all those bullet points from the previous slide. Some techniques that make it really strong, though, is make sure to tailor your personal statement for the specific project that you're applying to. You know, your roles may change, so making sure that it's customized shows the reviewers that you are, applying to the correct application, emphasizing the need for your particular expertise, and then looking at those 4 publications. Since you can only include 4, pick the most relevant that to the application or that demonstrate your particular role on this project. And then it's also really helpful to name or cite other collaborators that you've had or prior collaborations that are, again, relevant to the specific application to which you're applying. So in addition to the personal statement and your 4 publications, in section A, you can now include details about ongoing and completed research projects from the past 3 years that you want to draw attention to. So I've included here a screenshot of an example from the NIH template that they provide online, which you can download on your own. But just to give you an idea of how you might display that particular information. Those of you that have done biosketches in the past, you'll recognize this as looking very similar to what used to be called Section D research support. So for Section A research support, some things to remember. There is currently no limit on the number of research support that you can have listed here, as long as the overall length of the biosketch is still under 5 pages. There's also no limit on the length of Section A itself. Now, in the NIH guidelines, there are some length limitations to Section C, but just note that as of right now, you can have your narrative personal statement, your 4 publications, and any number of research support that you want to include all in Section A. Now, there's a little bit of flexibility in interpreting what is defined as research projects. So there is currently not a lot of guidelines, but the NIH is frequently updating their frequently asked questions. So I'd encourage you to check those if you're not sure whether to include something in under research projects or not. There's also no guidance on the specific information to be included. So on the previous screenshot, we saw that the PI's name was listed, start and end date, project title, but no project goal was listed, which would have previously been required in the old Section D research support. But the NIH guidelines currently don't necessarily define these. So the next slide, I'm going to talk about some best practices for what you should include here, but just note that if some of the information is missing, there aren't currently specific guidelines on that. So some options for how you would include research support would be include all your research support. We've seen over the past couple of months when technique investigators are doing is taking everything that was in Section D and just copying and pasting it into Section A and then deleting Section D. That's totally fine. There's nothing saying you can't do that. The example that NIH provides only lists 3 research support, but the guidelines themselves don't specify that number. So feel free to, include what would strengthen your application. So another option that we've seen, especially if you're tight on the page limitation and you're really up against that 5 pages, highlight the relevant research support, meaning, what research support do you have that's really relevant to this application that you're applying to? And then choose to highlight those as opposed to, putting a deluge of research support that goes on for pages and pages and maybe is not relevant. So either of these techniques are fine. There's also, you can eliminate this section entirely. There is no requirement that you include research support on your biosketch. You may include it, but you don't have to. So just to note that some of these changes were implemented because NIH is also making changes on the other support documentation, which you submit during the just-in-time process after your application's been submitted, where you would list all of your current and pending support. And so there's a little bit of duplication here. So there is a choice to just eliminate it entirely if you choose. I will say, over the last couple of months, as we've been gearing up for the implementation of these changes, the majority of our investigators have chosen to include all of their research support rather than highlighting or eliminating entirely, but all of these options are available to you. So for, I would say, best practices for research support, again, there's not as much guidance for the new updates, but you should only include either ongoing or recently completed, which means within the last 3 years. Again, and this is the same as it's always been, you're not supposed to include the number of person months or the direct costs, but some pieces that you can include, which really help the investigators understand the depth of your research support. Include a project title. If it has a grant number, include that. The PI name, especially if you are not the PI, the start and end dates of a project is helpful. And just to note that the words like ongoing, present, current don't really count as end dates. And the reason this is helpful to include is because the rule still stands that you can't include research over 3 years expired. So they want to make sure that it hasn't hit that date. So having an end date can be really helpful. The project goal can be helpful if the project title itself is not descriptive enough. And then if you're not the PI, listing your role on the project is helpful. And just to note, fellowships and research appointments don't belong here. And we'll talk about those later on. So that is section A. Next section is section B, which is positions, scientific appointments, and honors. And like section A, it does have some updates for applications on or after January 25th, 2022. And I have highlighted in bold the word scientific appointment because that is the new component. And so we'll talk about the requirements and then the new updates separately. So section B, list in reverse chronological order your positions, which includes any relevant positions that you've held or hold, not fellowships or education, because those go in the very top of the biosketch. And then if you have an expected position, meaning that you are going to be moving into a new position, maybe because of the grant or because you're in a transition phase, you can include the expected start date. So you can have sort of future positions listed. The next section here is the new section called scientific appointments, and I'm going to talk about that separately in the next slide. And then the third section for section B is honors, where you can list any professional achievements or awards. If you're a postdoc, you can include scholarships, traineeships, development awards, those kinds of things that are kind of, honors for you. If you're a clinician, it's helpful to include your licensures and board certifications so that if you are currently practicing physician. So section B's updates include the new section called scientific appointments. And what those are meant to include are any domestic or foreign appointments that do not fall into that position section. So this could include affiliations with foreign entities and or foreign governments. And if you're trying to decide whether to include something or not, it's regardless of remuneration, regardless of whether it's full-time or part-time or voluntary, it's essentially any kind of position. Maybe it's honorary, maybe it's not paid, but you do only need to include the current scientific appointments, so not things that you've held in the past necessarily. Since this is a new section, there are a lot of questions, and so there is a pretty detailed FAQs section on the NIH website for getting into more detail if you're not sure, but the NIH has recommended that if you are on the fence, you're not sure something should be included, just be clear and include it just to be safe, and then check the FAQs frequently to see if they've updated for more details. Section C is called contribution to science. So those of you familiar with biosketches, there have been no recent changes to this. And so I'm just going to go over the basic guidelines for section C. So contribution to science, formerly way back in the day, this used to be called publications. And now you are allowed to list a maximum of 5 contributions to science. Each of those can have a maximum of 4 publications or products per contribution. And each contribution it should be limited to a half page or less. Figures and graphics are not allowed. So what is a contribution to science? Essentially, it is a short paragraph that can include any of the following. So historical background of scientific problem, your central findings, the influence of those findings on the field, or if your contribution had any application to either health or technology, and then what your specific role was on that particular contribution. So with each contribution, as I mentioned, you are allowed to cite a maximum of 4 publications or products. And so I wanted to include a slide that explains what is a research product. So for the majority of you, you're only going to be including publications, and this can include both peer and non-peer reviewed, but any of these other items also count. So audio video products, patents, data or research materials or databases that you've developed, educational aids or curricula, instruments, equipment, models, protocols, software, netware, etc. Now, the last couple bullet points I added because these are newer additions and may also benefit more early stage or younger investigators who have less publication history. So you are allowed to cite meeting abstracts, posters, and other kinds of presentations, especially if they're invited presentations. And then one of the newest inclusions is this thing called interim research products, which includes preprints. I will note that there are specific citation guidelines for interim research products. So if you do have one of those, say you have a preprint, check the NIH website for exactly how to cite that properly, but you are certainly allowed to. Now, I will point out, though, that a preprint does not mean a publication that you have submitted for to a journal for publication. As of right now, you cannot cite a publication if it is under review. You can only cite it once it's been accepted for publication. Now, one of the most frequent questions that I get about this is related to the fact that, a lot of people always have publications in progress. How do you include those in your biosketch? So you can certainly include them in your discussion in the narrative portion. So you can say, I'm currently working on a publication on X, Y, and Z. You would just not include any citation information. So don't say the name of the journal, don't say the name of the article title. Those are all things that can change, and hold off on that. And then once it's accepted for publication, then you can include it as one of your 4 publications. So some other techniques that are not required, but can be really helpful for reviewers is provide a brief title for each of your contributions so reviewers know what the topic's about. Make it personal to you and your role. If you have multiple publications, since you can only cite 4 of them, you can always indicate how many total there are. So you can say, out of my 10 publications, here's the 4 most relevant, something like that. And then depending on your contributions, you don't have to use all 5. So you don't have to have 5 contributions. That's just the maximum amount. So for some investigators, it makes more sense to have fewer, but that are more detailed. I've seen techniques where, some people have sort of the 3 phases of their career, like, early, middle, and late, and each of those, the contributions in those. So there's some flexibility there. And yeah, being creative about what you consider a contribution. It can be a seminal paper, it can be a single experiment, it can be a series of related papers and experiments, etc. NIH does give you latitude to sort of define this how you'd like. So think about it in terms of you and your strengths, the specifics of the application to which you're applying, and just craft it with those things in mind. And then, as always, it's really helpful to emphasize the impact and innovation of those contributions. So at the end of section C, because you are limited in the number of publication citations that you have, you are allowed to provide a URL to a full list of all your published works in a publicly available digital database. Now, there's a couple of techniques for this, but one of the rules for NIH is that it must have a .gov address. So that means you can use my bibliography, which is tied into ScienceDB, which I'll get to in a second. You can use PubMed technically, although that can be inaccurate. So what I mean by that is my bibliography is an online system where you can add, draw down all your publications from PubMed. You can add in all your book chapters and kind of curate a full list. If you're short for time, or if you have an investigator who's never done this before, in a pinch, you can type your name into PubMed and it'll come up with a list of publications. It'll have a .gov address. but may not be accurate, especially if it's fairly common last name or something like that. And the other thing about My Bibliography or Science CV is that you build it within your My NCBI account. And so you have to select the option to make your My Bibliography link publicly available. So that way, when you include the URL, a reviewer can click on it and be taken to that list. If you don't select that option, a reviewer is not going to be able to see that list. So some other sites that may have your publications that you are not allowed to use would be Google Scholar, ResearchGate. Your lab keeps a list of your publications on their website. None of those can be used because they don't have that .gov address. So again, the URL is optional, but we highly recommend it, especially if you have more publications than fit on the limitations of your Biosketch. And just a reminder that you should spell out the full URL and not use hyperlinks. So if you have a word and the hyperlink is embedded in that word, NIH reviewers are not required to click on that. So it's best to have it all spelled out, and that way they can ensure that it does have a .gov address as well. So let's say you're an early stage investigator, you're putting your Biosketch together for the first time. What can you do with maybe limited publications or limited research expertise? So some of the techniques we find that are helpful is describe the work that you've done in labs that you've worked in, or work that you've done under mentorship. Contribution to science doesn't necessarily have to be some world-changing, groundbreaking work or stuff that you've necessarily led. Reviewers are going to understand that you're an early stage investigator and review accordingly. So just being realistic about the work that you've done to date. So you can discuss your current work or say something like during my training and then list what you're currently working on. And then, always clarify your role. You are your own best advocate. And so it's really demonstrating that you have the expertise, that you have the qualifications to participate in research. And so it's really about putting yourself in the best light within the limitations that you have. So be creative with those limitations and talk about current engagement and innovation and things like that. The NIH also offers some specific advice for new scientists. So, as I mentioned earlier, realizing that contributions are evaluated based on seniority. So they're not going to be expecting you to have all the publications or all the contributions that somebody with 20 extra years on you has. If you only have one publication, have one contribution to science where you summarize those key findings and their importance. If you have no publications, describe your efforts on others' projects or papers. Sometimes when you're maybe working as a graduate student in the lab, you might help collect data, but you maybe don't make it onto the publication. That's fine. You can work around that. If you have an investigator who has no research or thesis experience, NIH recommends just list one contribution, which is just your training to date. This can be really helpful if you have non-traditional stakeholders who are maybe coming from the community and maybe don't have, tons of experience in research labs, but maybe they have, life experience that can be included here instead. And again, as I mentioned before, you cannot include manuscripts in preparation or submitted, though you can include them in your narrative section. I would like to point out that this also applies to the publications that you cite in your personal statement as well. So some other advice, section D is, I've crossed it out here because the most recent updates have gotten rid of this section. So as a matter of course, we recommend that you just delete this section. If you have research support listed here, put it into section A. There are a few exemptions and when you might include section D for scholastic performance, but we're not going to get into those types of unique biosketches in this presentation. But that being said, I did want to bring up one other fairly new requirement that has some implications for your biosketch, and that is the ERA Commons ID requirement. So also starting on the same date, January 25th, 2022, An ERI Commons ID is required for all key personnel. So those of you familiar with biosketches will know that only the PIs of a project were required to have these, but starting now, it's any key personnel, meaning anybody who's providing a biosketch needs to have an ERI Commons ID. So I've cited the notice here that has that requirement listed. And just a heads up, if you're working with somebody who maybe doesn't have one yet or has never bothered to obtain one because they've never been a PI, depending on your institution, it can take up to 2 weeks to process it. So definitely have these discussions early. As you're collecting biosketches, make sure that you're reviewing that they're included. And then if not, working with your internal, sponsored projects office to obtain an ID. You will not be able to submit the biosketch for that person if you don't have the ERI Commons ID listed. So that's each section of the biosketch. I'm also going to talk about a few of the administrative components that apply to the entirety of the biosketch itself. So I've talked about what makes a strong biosketch, but there's also those, the technical aspects of what needs to be included. So some of these include, if you are citing publications, making sure that they're in the proper and a consistent format is always ideal. If they have a PMCID, you are required to include it. So make sure you don't accidentally leave it off. If you have the time, it's really helpful to proofread your paragraphs, both personal statement and contribution to science, for clarity or grammar. Just make sure it reads well. Checking adherence to the space limitations. That biosketch will get kicked back to you if it is not under the 5-page limit. Testing your URL just to make sure that it's active and that it's accurate, so that when reviewers click on it, they're not going to run into any problems either. Consider using ScienceEV to build your biosketch. ScienceEV is an online form that NIH has made that puts everything into the right format, so you don't have to worry about all this formatting stuff. So you can use that and not have to worry. Whatever technique you use, just using consistent formatting, and that includes font, spacing, literature citations. A clean biosketch is easier to read and makes it easier for reviewers to find what they're looking for. And then making sure that you have a maximum of 4 publications in each section and a maximum of 5 contributions in section C. I'm bringing this up because this is one of the biggest problems that we run into, where people list 5 publications in their personal statement and then maybe 6 publications in one of their contributions. For all things, each section, 4 publications max. So we want to make sure that you're sticking to those limits. And if you have more publications than you can list, use the URL to link off to everything else. So let's say you have so much information, you are butting up against that 5-page limit. What can you do to work around those space limitations without cutting content? Because we don't want you to cut out any of the scientific work you've done, but there are some formatting techniques that you can use to really get creative with squeezing everything in. So reducing indent paragraph spacing, if you're using a normal word processing system like MS Word, you'll notice that it gives you automatic sizing for indenting and paragraph spacing. That can all be shrunk. Using paragraph spacing rather than hard enters takes up less space. For citations, you can use et al. For authors' names. So after the first 3 names, just say et al. A lot of publications these days have 20, 30 authors. That right there can take up a half page of just listing names. So consider reducing it. Journals all have standard abbreviations. So if you know the standard abbreviation for your journal titles, you can use those instead of spelling them all out. And then, just check that half-page page limit on each of your contributions, just to evaluate the length. NIH is not, too nitpicky if you go a little bit over that half-page limit, but just be aware that they do indicate that each contribution in section C should be no longer than half a page, including the description and all those publications. So just something to keep in mind. So let's say all this formatting is too much work for you. What can you do? You can use ScienceEV, which stands for the Science Experts Network Curriculum Vitae, online system that NIH has created for you to build your biosketch. It does allow you to create biosketches in different formats, I believe including NSF even. And so everything is up to date. As NIH changes their guidelines, the system will update itself as well. If you're lucky enough to have an admin, you can assign them as a delegate to continually update your Biosketch over time. Just a heads up, as of January 20th of last year, 2021, NSF actually requires people to use ScienceEV for building. So although NIH doesn't explicitly require that now, that may be the way that they're going. Another benefit is that ScienceEV can link to your publications on PubMed or those that you listed in My Bibliography, so it's easily to just kind of click and drag everything into one place. There are numerous tutorials available online that help you get started, troubleshoot, all that stuff. And then just a heads up that the system does ensure correct formatting, and it's exportable either as a PDF or a Word doc. So if you need to do some additional formatting, you can export it as Word before PDFing it for the final submission, but it does give you the option, which is great. So if you're still confused after this, where do you go? Well, there is a central inbox developed for the NIH specifically for the new Biosketch updates and also the other support. Work with your sponsored projects office if you need to get in touch with this inbox. The NIH, as I mentioned before, has really thorough FAQs available for both Biosketch and other support. So visit them frequently. The more questions they get, the more they update this, and it's a really helpful resource for some of those trickier questions that you might have. The UCLA CTSI also has a page that we've developed for a bunch of common NIH rules, including Biosketches, where we have all this updated information. And we also link off to all of the NIH templates and guidelines. And we also have our own individual checklists for helping make sure that you stay in alignment with NIH applications rules, while also making your Biosketch as strong as possible. And there's also a lot of other resources there, not just for Biosketches, but all other kinds of NIH components that you might be interested in. And then we'll have this YouTube video coming soon, also on that website, so you can come and revisit this as often as you like. My office is always available here to help answer any questions as well. So if you want to give us a call, email us, visit our website. We also have office hours, although I will note that as of 2022, these office hours are still remote. So please email us to figure out how to access that if you would like to talk with us. But we are always happy to answer any questions that you might have about Biosketches or anything else, any other nuances about the NIH application. So thank you for sticking with me today. I hope you've learned some helpful tidbits about making your application as strong as possible. And again, feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions. Thank you.